Neighbor, neighbor, is your boy Trini Trent. Hear this now. I want to have a conversation about representation. I've touched on this topic across several videos over the last few weeks, but today I really want to dive a little bit deeper. I want to flesh it out just a bit more because I think it's something that we can really have a great conversation about. Now, here in Trinidad and Tobago, where I live, American media is king. American media is king. Now, if you don't know, Trinidad is in the Caribbean and we are right on the doorstep of America. And so many different American media products are basically pumped into the region. So much of American culture is exported and shared all throughout the region, especially here in Trinidad and Tobago, where we absorb so much of the American, music, television, film, fashion, trends. So much of it has become basically integrated into Trinidadian culture. Yet in the midst of all of this, in the sea of all the information, in the Caribbean Sea that come washing down toward us, in the current, with all of this that's coming in, it's ironic that we still hardly ever, or almost never, see representations of Trinidadians in that American media. We are very rarely mentioned, Trinidad and Tobago as a country or even just individuals, very, very rarely mentioned in American media. It might just be a passing moment. It might just be a quick joke or a quick reference, but it's never really a thought that is prominent, that is dwelled upon, and that is fleshed out. And in many ways, the only time that we see ourselves is when we create the media for ourselves. When we produce the music, when I think about soca, which I recently spoke about here on the channel, and I think about calypso and steel pan, and I think about all of the different things that we have culturally happening here in Trinidad and Tobago, especially carnival culture, that's when we see ourselves. That's when we hear ourselves. And I even think about those great moments in film. We have a growing, it's still small, but a growing film industry here. And of course, over the decades, the different scripted television shows that have come out, especially my fave, Westwood Park. Here now, let me tell you quick about Westwood Park. I did love Westwood Park. Westwood Park, I think it used to show on a Sunday night. And I used to find myself, no matter where I was in the house, at the foot of my mother's bed. Because me and my mother used to sit down and watch Westwood Park. That was the only show that we had in common. Because other than that, I was watching Xena and Buffy. And my mother didn't have time for that. And I used to sit down and watch my Westwood Park with my mother. And all of the different characters like Mr. Herbert, Vashti and she evil twin, here now, Ava and Shiman. To this day, anytime me and my mother, my mother and I, anytime we eat a piece of pone, which is a delicacy here in Trinidad and Tobago, pone. Anytime we eat pone, we always say the running joke because it was a line from that show by an actor. And he said, Ava, would you like some pone? He was talking to his wife, To this day, anytime we eat pone, which is rare, but whenever we see it, we have to put on that accent because it was so funny. And what made it so engaging and so exciting for us is that we were seeing ourselves. These are people who are eating the foods that we eat, dressed in the way that we dress. I hope you didn't notice I just swallowed spit. First, my throat dry. Pretend you didn't see that. Eating the food that we eat, dressing the way that we dress, talking the way that we talk, connecting with each other, really in a space where we are seeing similar scenes. You're seeing the UE campus, or you're seeing a road that you recognize, or a corner that you recognize, or a building that you recognize. It's exciting because you're actually seeing your community and your people on screen. But at the same time, although America is king, there's a queen. There's another country that follows very closely behind regarding the impact that it has on Trinidad and Tobago to this day. And that is Jamaica. Trinidad and Tobago, we exist, and many other Caribbean countries probably could share this experience. We exist in this very odd space where we're like almost an invisible minority in the shadow of Jamaica. My neighbor dog might start back, ignore him, or it, or whatever. I don't know which one going crazy tonight. But you see, in many ways, we exist as this invisible minority in the shadow of Jamaica. And that's because in the eyes of many people in the world, Jamaica is the Caribbean. We aren't always acknowledged as individual nations, individual countries with our own contributions to the world. Even though so many things from the other countries are known, they are often even tied and attributed to Jamaica. For example, the steel pan from Trinidad is seen as an instrument that comes from the Caribbean. And when people think Caribbean, they think Jamaica, so they think steel pan is Jamaican. And I've heard that come from American people that I've met. We exist in this shadow. And that's not on the fault of Jamaica. Don't get me wrong. Jamaica has done quite well for itself as this amazing nation that has contributed so much to the world. But that's because so many of Jamaican cultural exports have become ingrained in different corners of the planet and the way that many people connect to each other. You think of reggae music. That has become so integrated into American, Canadian, UK, European culture. There are people in Australia who sing reggae. And then, of course, you have the different cultural icons who have helped to establish Jamaica on the global scene, such as Bob Marley. And then you even have the athletes and the different superstars like Usain Bolt. These are people who have really helped to make Jamaica a part of the cultural conversation on a global scale. But for the rest of us in the Caribbean, who don't have those similar icons, or who don't always have icons that make a lasting impact as Trinidadian, or as St. Lucian, or as Guyanese, people may know them, but they may not know where they're from. We kind of get lost in the shuffle. And what happens when people aren't fully represented, especially in media? What they tend to do, in my observation, is one of three things. They either assimilate, where they try to just basically blend in and they go with the flow, they just do what everybody else is doing in order to be successful. Or they completely separate and create their own space. Or they go the next way, where they try to demand a seat at the table and create a space within the existing system and structure. So when I think of assimilation, when I think of blending in, when I think of just going with the flow and doing what you need to do to be successful in the existing structure, what I think about a good example is in that 2008 to 2010 period, and something that R&B artists had to face. I spoke about this during the In Retrospect Mariah Carey series here on the channel. I'm going to keep plugging it forever and ever, as long as I have this YouTube channel, or they go on here and talk about it. People in that period of time, in order to be successful, R&B artists, we saw them, really scaling back on the way they perform and sang songs and really adopting so much of electronic dance music into their productions. In order to remain trending in what was considered pop, they had to assimilate, they had to sacrifice and compromise a lot of what was normally associated with contemporary or even traditional R&B in order to fit in. And on the other side of things, we have people who separate and create their own spaces. So what we tend to see are people who decide, okay, I don't see myself in this structure. And instead of trying to fit in, instead of trying to just go with the flow, instead of sacrificing my art or who I am, I'm going to build a structure in which I can be successful as I am and in the way that I want to be. And I think of different examples of this, and each of these all required a great deal of resources and a great deal of buy-in from the same community that you're trying to represent. I was thinking of Soul Train. And the Soul Train television show, it really was a successful example, because what it did is that it showed and reflected Black people back to themselves. The artistry, the music, the performances of Black people. This dog will not get one cuss from me tonight. Me and this dog, eh? Anyway, Soul Train really showed Black people themselves. But there are examples where it doesn't always work. And I think of the BET Awards. The BET Award show has been so wonderful for so many people. It has really shown Black people their strength and rewarded and celebrated so many Black icons over the years. But when it comes to the awards themselves, they aren't always held to the same regard as, let's say, the Grammy Awards. And I'm one of those people who participated in that way of thinking before I became enlightened. Back in my day, I remembered being part of conversations and saying shady things about different artists and saying, well, all he has or all she has is a BET Award. She don't have a Grammy. And in that way, it's showing that the BET Awards didn't fully get the buy-in from different communities that it was trying to serve, because people still, regardless of the quality of the show, even though it had better performances than the Grammys, when it came to the quality of the show, people still weren't holding that honor on the same level of a Grammy Award. But for those who choose not to separate or to assimilate, what some folks try to do is basically just create an enclave within the existing structure. What they try to do is just basically demand a seat at the table. They try to say, okay, I want to succeed. I don't want to build my own structure, but I want to have a space within the existing structure. And as a person in this same space as you, I deserve that. And when you talk about finding a seat at the table or getting a seat at the table, what that typically means is that you have to approach the person who you think owns the rights to that table and asks them for permission to have a seat there. Or you turn to them and you demand a seat there. But by doing that, you're acknowledging that they are the dominant group. And I can't judge anybody from having to do this, because there was a point in time when I used to say when I was younger, oh, stop turning to this group or that group, just make your own. But understanding the work and the resources that go into that, it makes things a lot more complicated. It's not that easy, especially when I think of an example of America and I think about the different challenges that African American people and other Black Americans face. Finding a space in a structure that is dominated by whiteness and having to find a space where they can create and be successful and be acknowledged by their peers across the American region, the American continent, and across the world beyond just continental America. And people are having this conversation about why not just break away, but understanding that within the construct of America, these institutions, these companies are run and dominated by white people. And if these people own, I'm not demonizing white people here, by the way, I'm just having a matter of fact, clear conversation here. If this one particular group of people, if they own the resources, they own the products of the resources, and they say who gets access to those products of resources, it's very difficult for anybody who exists in a system that is so humongous and so much larger than this one particular group. It is very much a challenge for anybody to rise up and break completely free, especially understanding the way that institutional classism, racism, and power work in America. So in that conversation, I can understand where sometimes the fight, and it sometimes might be even easier to either assimilate or fight for a space at the table instead of trying to build your own table. It sometimes works out, but sometimes it really doesn't. And what happens when a person finally makes it? Let's say a person from a particular group. What happens when a person from one group finally breaks through and finally becomes very successful? Is that it triggers a great deal of pressure and expectation for that person, either on their behalf or from outside, from other people within the group that they represent or they're expected to represent. There's a great deal of pressure and expectation that comes down. And that leads me to my next point. It is really impossible to expect one person or a couple of people to represent an entire group, an entire society, an entire country or region. It is impossible to expect them to represent every different identity that exists within these spaces, because at the end of the day, we all exist in intersectional realities, intersectional identities. We aren't all the same. Two people could be from the same group, but they have completely different lived experiences and completely different looks and views on life based on their experiences and based on their own genetics, based on their color of skin, based on their height, their age, their sexuality, their gender, their religion, their background. And we exist within the same country and the same space. So one person can't possibly represent that entire group. And that's why it is also necessary to have diversity in representation. It's not just about having somebody represent a group or saying, okay, we're going to have a token person, because that's when tokenism comes in. When you have one person expected to represent everybody, but instead have several people from a particular community present and in the conversation. If we are going to be talking about, having a seat at the table, have several seats lined up. Representation is important. People just want to be seen and they just want to know that they matter. That who they are as they are has value. And I'm reminded of this every single time I go out for a jog. I was going to say when I meet people, sure, but I don't go wrong nobody, child. When I out going from a little jog, especially in COVID, when I'm out from a run and I'm around children in the savannah and they're passing on their bikes or they're passing on their scooters or they're just running by, and I'm seeing 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds speaking in American accents. And I sit back and there's a little piece of me that goes into judgment, because I'm like, what are these parents teaching these kids? Because none of them sound like Trinidadians. But then on the other side of it is, what can they show their kids? Other than the parents teaching the kids how to be, when these kids sit down and they look at cartoons and they look at television, they don't see themselves. They go on YouTube or they watch anything on an iPad or the little devices. They don't see themselves. They see American icons. And these are the people they aspire to be, because when you don't see yourself, you try to find the next best thing. And as I'm about to go, I have a little question for you. I always have a question. Do you feel represented in the media? Do you feel that who you are and people from your community are really represented in the media where you are? Let me know now. Tell me where you're from. Tell me where you're living. And let's have a conversation about it. Say where you're from and say if you feel represented in the media. And if you don't feel represented, Add on to the piece. Tell me how you think this can change, because I think these conversations are important as we really understand who we are and how we are being seen and portrayed to the world. Anyway, I'm real sweating, and you see that dog next door? I have a little surprise for him. Anyway, all you, let me go before Peter come knocking on my door. All right? I'll go check all you next time. Later.